In this video, you'll learn how authors develop a central idea throughout a text. I want to look quickly at the central idea rubric because there's a jump between meeting standard and exceeding standard and advanced. So if we look at our rubric for meeting standard, in meeting standard, you're determining a central idea of a text and how it's conveyed or shown through particular details. You're also explaining how specific details reveal the central idea. In exceeding standard, this is where it changes. You are doing that. However, you're also explaining the development of the central idea throughout a text. In advanced, you need to be able to both explain how the author develops the central idea over the course of a text, but also discuss the relationship of the central idea to its supporting ideas or details. We're going to talk about how to do that a little bit later in this video, but I want to just give you a hint. I want you to think a little bit about author's purpose when you think about the relationship, and why does the author use that detail to support the central idea? So authors develop a central idea in the same way that a comic develops a story, frame by frame. So if we think about this comic, each box or each frame, each box in a comic is called a frame. Each frame develops the story, right? It isn't until the very end that we laugh when Garfield gets this huge acorn in his face. Each frame is needed to get to the end of the story, to develop the story. In the same way that the comics do that, frame by frame, authors of informational texts develop a central idea, paragraph by paragraph, or section by section, or chunk by chunk. So let's think a little bit about the article we've already read, the glacier article. The central idea of this article is that the burning of fossil fuels is heating up the earth at such a rapid rate that glaciers will melt and cause sea levels to rise. So if we look at our chunks, what we summarized for our chunks, the supporting details in each section, we notice that Arctic glaciers are collapsing, causing sea levels to rise. So right away, we have part of the central idea discussed here. So that Arctic glaciers are melting, okay, and that sea levels are rising. In the second section, we learned that the burning of fossil fuels is to blame for this, right? It causes the earth to warm. Okay. We also learned a little bit later that Arctic glacier specifically is large enough that it's going to cause a huge rise in sea level, and then the Thwaites Glacier is a great example of this, and it's going to cause sea levels to rise by 2 feet. All of these details work together to develop or to support that one central idea. So I want you to think of it almost like, kind of like a house, right? We have our supporting details that all support one big idea. And without each supporting detail, we wouldn't have that central idea as fully developed. So this is an outline of the text that we've been reading the last couple of days about how climate change affects poor countries. So our central idea is that climate change unequally affects developing countries because of the CO2 emitted by developed countries. So we have a couple things that we need the author to prove to us, if that's a central idea. We need the author to prove that climate change unequally affects developing countries. We need him to prove that it's because of CO2 emitted by developed countries or by richer countries. So if we looked at each section or chunk, if we broke the text into 3 sections, here are the big supporting details that we see in the text. So in the beginning, the author discusses how climate change will impact agriculture, right, farming, which poor countries depend on. Okay, so that's the first detail that we see. There are a lot of other smaller details, but when we think about the development of the central idea, this is how we're going to think about it, these larger summaries of what's happening in the text or what the author is teaching us throughout the text. Okay, so the next supporting detail is that he explains how rising temperatures will lead to more health risks for poorer countries, right? So that's one of the other ways that we see that climate change is unequally affecting developing countries. And then finally, okay, this is where he proves CO2 is emitted by developed countries. Finally, he illustrates how developed countries or richer countries are the ones emitting the most CO2, which is linked with global warming and, in turn, affects developing countries. Each of these three supporting details is needed to really make this central idea strongly developed, right? To really make the central idea strongly supported. So I want to look at how do we explain then how each detail supports the central idea or how it reveals the central idea. So I want to do three things in my explanation, and this is how, if we go back to our rubric, let's look at our rubric really fast. In order to get exceeding standard, your explanation needs to be detailed, right? It needs to be detailed and it needs to explain the relationship to the supporting ideas. So I need to do three things in my explanation if I want an exceeding standard or an advanced, and I know you do. Okay, so the first thing I need to do is I'm going to describe the detail. Okay, so I'm going to highlight that in green. The next thing I'm going to do, okay, is I want to explain why, why the author chose this detail. And lastly, I want to explain how it supports the central idea. Okay, so remember our central idea is that climate change unequally affects developing countries because of the CO2 emitted by developed countries. So I'm going to work with just this first detail right here. In the beginning, the author discusses how climate change will impact agriculture, which poorer countries depend on. So I'm just looking at the detail about agriculture. So let me read it to you once and let's see if we can highlight the different components of my explanation. He describes this issue because it is one of the impacts of climate change that most drastically affects poorer countries as opposed to richer countries. In many poorer countries, agriculture is the primary industry. Disasters, rising temperatures, and rising sea levels all affect farming, greatly impacting poor countries. This detail highlights the inequity between how climate change will affect richer and poorer countries. Okay, so I'm doing a couple things. I'm starting actually with my explaining why the author chose this detail. So I'm starting here. He describes this issue because it is one of the impacts of climate change that most drastically affects poorer countries as opposed to richer countries. I don't have to start with explaining why the author chose this detail. I could start with describing the detail or explaining how it supports the central idea, but this is how it worked to format it for me. So he describes the issue because it is one of the impacts of climate change that most drastically affects poorer countries as opposed to richer countries. Remember, I hinted at the author's purpose. This is my author's purpose here, right? The author intentionally does this so that we come to this understanding. Okay, so now I'm going to actually describe the detail. I'm going to explain it in my own words. In many poorer countries, agriculture is the primary industry. Disasters, rising temperatures, and rising sea levels all affect farming, greatly impacting poor countries. So I'm just explaining the detail to you. How does climate change affecting agriculture really have a negative impact on my poor countries? Okay, so now I'm going to explain how the central idea is supported through this detail. This detail highlights the inequity between how climate change will affect richer and poorer countries. Remember, my central idea is that climate change unequally affects developing countries. So now I'm really explaining that down here. So you'll notice that my explanation is 4 sentences. What I want you to do right now is I want for you to try to do the same thing. I want for you to choose one of our second or third details. You can choose either one. And I want for you in your composition notebook to try to answer the question, how does this detail reveal the theme? And I really encourage you to try to write a 4 to 5 sentence explanation where you describe the detail, explain why the author chose this detail, and explain how it supports the central idea. Okay. Enjoy!